Some buildings remember the people who lived inside them long after everyone else has moved on, and on dreadful visions. The most disturbing stories are rarely about what hides in the dark, but about the ordinary sounds that continue long after they should have stopped. There is something uniquely unsettling about realizing that the person you've been hearing every night may not have been there at all. Story 1. The Voice from Apartment 14B. 28-year-old Daniel Moreno moved into the Ashbury Heights apartments during the final week of November after accepting a new accounting position in downtown Chicago. The building stood on the edge of Lincoln Park, occupying a narrow corner lot between a bookstore and an old family-owned diner. Constructed sometime in the early 1940s, Ashbury Heights carried the kind of charm that newer apartments struggled to imitate. Original hardwood floors, brass elevator doors, and radiators that hissed softly throughout the winter gave the place a warm, lived-in atmosphere. Daniel considered himself lucky to find an affordable unit in such a desirable neighborhood. Apartment 13B sat on the 13th floor, directly beneath 14B. The first few nights passed without incident. Daniel unpacked boxes, assembled furniture, and adjusted to his new routine. His job required early mornings, so he usually found himself in bed before midnight. That was when he first noticed her. At exactly 11:47 p.m., footsteps echoed softly from the apartment above. Not heavy footsteps, not pacing, just ordinary movement. Someone walking from one room to another. A minute later came the sound of a kettle beginning to whistle, then cabinets opening, the clink of ceramic mugs, and finally, faint jazz music drifting through the ceiling. The same sequence happened the next night, and the night after that. By the end of the week, Daniel could practically predict every sound before it occurred. He found it oddly comforting. Somebody upstairs enjoyed tea before bed. Somebody listened to old records. Somebody maintained routines just as carefully as he did. One Friday evening, Daniel mentioned his neighbor while riding the elevator with another resident. An older woman carrying groceries glanced toward him. "The woman in 14B?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "Yeah, she stays up pretty late." The woman's expression changed almost immediately. Without another word, she stepped out when the doors opened and continued down the hallway. Daniel assumed she'd simply misheard him. Still, the interaction lingered in his mind. The following week, he encountered similar reactions. The building's superintendent suddenly remembered another task whenever Daniel mentioned apartment 14B. A younger tenant awkwardly changed the subject. Even the mailman looked uncomfortable. Nobody outright refused to discuss the woman upstairs. They simply avoided doing so. One particularly cold evening, Daniel returned home carrying groceries and noticed a stack of packages near the mailboxes. Every apartment number appeared except one, 14B. Curious, he asked the superintendent whether his upstairs neighbor traveled frequently. The older man paused, long enough to make Daniel uncomfortable. Then he quietly replied that some people preferred their privacy. That was all. The strange behavior should have ended Daniel's curiosity. Instead, it strengthened it. At 11:47 p.m. that same night, the familiar routine began once more. Footsteps, the kettle, jazz music. For the first time, Daniel climbed the stairs. The 14th floor hallway looked identical to every other level in the building. Soft yellow lighting, old carpets, framed photographs of Chicago from decades past. Apartment 14B sat at the very end. Warm light glowed faintly beneath the door. Daniel hesitated, then laughed at himself. He was acting as though he intended to investigate a crime rather than introduce himself to a neighbor. He took a small sticky note from his pocket and wrote a simple message. "Hi, I'm Daniel from 13B below you. Sorry if I've ever been noisy while moving in. Nice to meet you." He placed the note beside the door and returned downstairs. The following morning, the paper was gone. In its place rested another note. The handwriting looked elegant and deliberate. "Sorry about the noise. I'll try to be quieter tonight." Daniel stared at the message for several seconds. Because there was one detail he couldn't explain. He had never written his apartment number, and yet beneath the signature, the woman had added 3 words. "Your upstairs neighbor. Your upstairs neighbor." Daniel read the message 3 times. The handwriting looked old-fashioned, almost elegant, with careful loops and perfectly straight lines. Whoever had written it knew exactly where he lived, despite the fact that he had never mentioned his apartment number. The strange detail lingered in his mind throughout the day. That evening, after work, he decided to ask someone directly. The building manager, a man named Richard Collins, occupied a small office beside the lobby mailroom. Richard had managed Ashbury Heights for nearly 20 years and knew every tenant by name. When Daniel casually mentioned apartment 14B, Richard immediately stopped typing. The silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable. Daniel laughed nervously. "The woman upstairs left me a note this morning. I figured I'd introduce myself properly sometime." Richard slowly removed his glasses. "What note?" Daniel showed him the paper. The color drained from the older man's face. He read it once, then again. Finally, he asked a question that made Daniel uneasy. "You got this morning?" Daniel nodded. Richard locked the office door. "The woman who lived in 14B was named Eleanor Whitmore," he said quietly. "She passed away 3 weeks ago." The sentence felt absurd. Daniel immediately shook his head. "That's impossible." Every night at exactly 11:47, he heard her. The footsteps, the kettle, the music, everything. Richard explained that Eleanor had been 82 years old and had lived in the building for nearly 4 decades. She rarely spoke to neighbors, listened to jazz records every evening, and drank tea before bed at precisely the same time every night. After she passed away peacefully in her sleep, her remaining family collected personal belongings and left the apartment untouched while legal matters were settled. Nobody had entered since. Nobody possessed keys except management. Daniel didn't know what to say. That night, he sat in complete silence. 11:47 p.m. arrived. The footsteps began, soft, measured, moving from one room to another. A minute later came the whistle of a kettle, then cabinet doors, then jazz music, exactly as always. His blood ran cold, because now he knew who those sounds supposedly belonged to. Unable to ignore it any longer, Daniel called Richard. 20 minutes later, both men stood outside apartment 14B. The hallway felt strangely warm. Soft yellow light spilled beneath the doorway, and from inside came the unmistakable sound of an old jazz record. Richard's hands trembled. He unlocked the door. The moment it opened, the music stopped. Silence flooded the apartment. The interior looked frozen in time. Dust coated every surface. Furniture remained covered with protective sheets. The electricity had been disconnected weeks earlier. No lamps, no television, no source of light whatsoever. Yet moments earlier, Daniel had clearly seen brightness beneath the door. The 2 men slowly searched each room. Nobody was there. No signs of intruders. No recent footprints. Nothing. Then Daniel entered the kitchen. The kettle rested on the stove, still warm. Richard touched it, immediately pulling his hand away. "That shouldn't be possible," he whispered. There hadn't been gas service to the unit since Eleanor's death. The kitchen walls displayed dozens of framed photographs. Birthdays, Christmas gatherings, family vacations. And in nearly every picture, Eleanor wore the same blue sweater. The exact sweater Daniel had seen 2 nights earlier. Because for a brief moment, while returning home from work, he had glanced upward and noticed a woman standing behind the frosted glass beside apartment 14B. He'd assumed she was alive. He'd assumed she was simply his neighbor. Suddenly, a record player crackled somewhere deeper in the apartment. Soft jazz music began playing once again. Neither man waited to investigate. They left immediately. The following week, Daniel broke his lease. Richard understood completely. No penalties, no questions. Just paperwork signed as quickly as possible. Months later, Daniel returned to Chicago for a friend's birthday. Curiosity drew him back toward Ashbury Heights. The building looked unchanged. The same brass elevator, The same lobby. The same old photographs. Richard still worked behind the front desk. Older. More tired. Yet unsurprised to see him. They spoke for several minutes before Daniel finally asked the question he'd avoided since moving away. What happened to apartment 14B? Richard looked toward the elevator. Nobody moved in. Nobody wanted it. Before Daniel could respond, music drifted faintly through the building. Jazz. Soft. Warm. Familiar. Daniel checked his watch. 11:47 p.m. The sound came from directly above them. Richard didn't even look up. Instead, he smiled sadly. She always hated sleeping in silence. Daniel never returned after that night. Apartment 14B remains empty to this day. Official records list it as unoccupied. Utility companies confirm that no electricity or gas has been used there since Eleanor Whitmore passed away. Yet longtime residents still hear footsteps every evening. A kettle beginning to whistle. Cabinets opening. And old jazz records playing softly above their heads. Not with anger. Not with malice. Simply the quiet routines of someone who spent 40 years calling that place home and perhaps never realized she had already left it behind. If this story unsettled you, let me know whether you would have stayed after learning the truth. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more dark tales from Dreadful Visions. Sleep well tonight, if you can.